Empathy is increasingly becoming one of the most important abilities expected from conversational AI. As LLMs enter education, healthcare, and everyday communication, a natural question emerges: who produces responses people perceive as more empathetic? Humans or LLMs? In this study, we address this through a large scale comparison using both human evaluators and an LLM judge. LLMs are already very strong at traditional language tasks, but empathy is different. It's subjective, context dependent, and harder to measure with standard automatic metrics. Existing work also has some limitations. Many studies rely mostly on automatic evaluation, focus mainly on healthcare settings, or use within subject designs where the same participant compares multiple model outputs. This can introduce bias as well as it's not scalable when LLMs become updated or when newer LLMs get introduced. So, our goal here is to evaluate empathetic responses in a more rigorous and scalable way, and also ask whether LLMs themselves can judge empathy in a way that aligns with human judgments. Our study is framed around three questions. First, we ask who generates more empathetic responses, humans or LLMs. Second, we ask if LLMs can reliably judge empathy rather than only generate empathetic text. Third, we examine whether humans and LLM judges show differences when evaluating responses. These questions are important because empathy evaluation is not just about comparing models, but it's also about understanding whether evaluators, human or AI, are fair, reliable, and also scalable. To answer these questions, we use the Empathetic Dialogues dataset. We sampled 2000 dialogue prompts covering 32 positive and negative emotions, and the original human written responses for these dialogue prompts serve as our baseline. For the same prompts, we generate responses from GPT-4, LLaMA 270 billion chat, Gemini 1.0 Pro, and Mixtral 18 to 7 billion instruct. This enables us to directly compare humans and LLMs responses across same emotional contexts. Next, let me explain how we design the evaluation. A key decision here was to use a between subjects design. Instead of showing participants responses from multiple sources, each participant evaluated responses from only one source, either humans or one of the four LLMs. This helps reduce comparison effects and biases that can arise when one participant evaluates different systems. We recruited 1,000 crowd workers divided equally across the five groups. Each participant evaluated 10 responses from their assigned source and rated how empathetic they found each response on a simple 3 point scale: bad, okay, or good. And this design allows us to obtain large scale human judgments while keeping the evaluation fair and scalable across different models. To answer our second research question, can LLMs reliably judge the empathy of responses? We introduce a dual judge framework. Every response in the dataset is evaluated twice, once by a human judge and once by an LLM judge. Specifically, in our case, it was GPT-4o Mini. This gives us two independent sets of ratings for exactly the same responses. Overall, this resulted in 20,000 evaluations, 10,000 from humans and 10,000 from the LLM judge. Having both these perspectives allows us to compare not only which responses are perceived as more empathetic, but also how closely human and LLM evaluations align with each other. We can then analyze agreement between judges, differences in rating distributions, and potential biases in how empathy is assessed. Now let's look at our first research question: who generates more empathetic responses? Here we are looking at the ratings provided by human evaluators. Compared to human written responses, we can see that the responses generated by all four LLMs receive more good ratings and fewer bad ratings. The pattern we see here is quite consistent across both positive and negative emotional situations. You can see that this trend holds across almost all models and across both categories of emotions, positive and negative. The chi-square test also show that these differences are significant. The key takeaway is that from the perspective of human evaluators, LLM generated responses are generally perceived as more empathetic than the original human written responses. Next, we ask whether an LLM would reach the same conclusion when acting as the evaluator. Here, the same set of responses was rated by GPT-4o Mini acting as an LLM judge. And interestingly, we observe the same overall pattern as before, but even more strongly. LLM generated responses receive substantially more good ratings and substantially fewer bad ratings than human written responses across both positive and negative emotional dialogues. So, despite being an entirely different evaluator, the LLM judge independently reaches the same conclusion as the human judges. However, it also raises an important question. If both judges agree on the ranking, do they evaluate empathy in exactly the same way? That's what we will see next. To examine these differences more closely, we compute statistics for agreement, bias, and distributional differences between the human and the LLM ratings for human written and LLM generated responses. First, if we look at agreement, the level of agreement between humans and the LLM judge is only slight to fair. Interestingly, agreement is somewhat higher when evaluating human written responses, while there is more disagreement when evaluating LLM generated responses. However, these disagreements are not simply random noise. The large and statistically significant Wilcoxon signed rank test values, they show that the differences between human and LLM ratings are systematic. To understand these differences, we also examine the direction and strength of the disagreement. The Hodges-Lemma shift tells us which evaluator tends to give higher ratings, while the rank by serial correlation indicates the strength of that tendency. What we observe is a very consistent pattern for both positive and negative emotional contexts. Human evaluators rate human written responses more favorably than the LLM judge does. At the same time, the LLM judge rates LLM generated responses more favorably than human evaluators do. So, even though both judges agree on the overall conclusion that LLM responses are more empathetic, they appear to apply somewhat different criteria when evaluating empathy. To further visualize these differences, we plot Sankey diagrams showing how ratings from one judge map to ratings from the other. If we look at the first diagram, which focuses on human written responses, we see that human evaluators tend to rate these responses more favorably. When the same responses are evaluated by the LLM judge, many of those ratings shift downwards towards the okay or bad categories. In other words, the LLM judge is more critical of human written responses than humans are. Now, if we look at the second diagram for LLM generated responses, we can observe the opposite pattern. Here, the LLM judge frequently upgrades responses towards the good category, whereas human evaluators are somewhat more conservative in their ratings. What's important is that these patterns appear consistently across both positive and negative emotional contexts. From these observations, we can deduce that humans tend to be more favorable towards human written responses, while the LLM judge tends to be more favorable towards LLM generated responses. And this provides further evidence that humans and LLMs apply somewhat different evaluative criteria when judging empathy. And this suggests that empathy is not a single objective construct, but is influenced by the perspective of the evaluator. Moving on to the main takeaways from our study, we learned that LLM generated responses are consistently rated as more empathetic than human written responses by both human and LLM judges. But at the same time, agreement between the two judges was only slight to fail. This suggests that even when they agree on the overall trend, they are not necessarily using the same criteria. There are systematic differences and self favoring tendencies. These findings show that modern LLMs are highly effective at producing language perceived empathetic, so they can be used in many applications requiring emotional intelligence. But when it comes to evaluation of empathy, it's highly evaluator dependent. The high ratings may sometimes reflect evaluator preferences for explicit validation rather than deep understanding, which may raise concerns related to AI syncophancy. Overall, our observations point to the need for building richer evaluation frameworks that combine human judgment, calibrated LLM judges, and task specific criteria. So, the bottom line is that LLMs are good at producing language perceived empathetic, but empathy evaluation depends on who is judging it. Building frameworks that can differentiate perceived empathy from deep understanding, and also those can account for how both humans and LLMs bring their own perspectives into the judgment, will be essential for building trustworthy empathetic AI systems. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.